share that sometimes HR pros struggle with being the participant in an interview process rather than designing the interview process. Second, if you're here today to learn more about what candidates are thinking about the interview process, what pros are coaching them on how to navigate it, there'll be insights on how to view that process through the candidate lens and better hone your own efforts. Guiding our discussion today is Julia Holian. Julia has deep expertise in the talent space. A very successful TA professional for many years, she has pivoted to helping talent secure their ideal roles as a career strategist. More than a resume and interview coach, Julia and her teammates at Holian Associates help clients discover and hone what that next role might be, and then formulate an action plan that propels them forward to success. Julia, thank you for joining us today, and we please take it from here.
Thank you so much, Danica. So happy to be here. So today we've got a packed presentation about what it's like to enter into the candidate experience of interviewing. So I'm Julia Holian of Holian Associates. And if you could, Jessica, advance to the next slide, we'll kind of talk about what we're going to go through. We're going to talk about what it's like to apply for jobs. We're going to cover a little bit about resume essentials, things that you should know about. But we're really going to focus on preparing for interviews, the types of interviews that you're going to have, some of the questions that you might get asked. And then we're going to talk about really what it's like to go through the interview process. So let's get started on sort of the 4 pillars of applying to jobs. So they're really kind of these 4 channels when you're looking for jobs. There's job boards, which I think are essential. I tend to look at job boards almost more for informational purposes. Sometimes you might apply to jobs. I think it depends on the level that you're at if you're going to apply. But job boards can be a great place to find out which companies out there are growing, who's hiring, who works in the sort of the arena that you're looking for. So job boards are important to look at. But I think recruiting firms are also an area that you should work in. That's where, Danica comes in. If you're looking for an HR role, you want to be talking to people like Danica. It's a big part of who should be in your network. They are a wealth of information, and they're working with key companies, and they have a lot of internal experience and knowledge that they can share with you. So recruiters are also people that you should be connecting with. Connect on LinkedIn, get to know who they are, get to know those people who specialize in the areas that you're looking for. But what people often don't think about is creating a list of target companies. If there are certain companies that you want to work for, whether it's based on industry or geography or certain areas that you want to work in, creating a list of target companies is one of the biggest things that you can do to look for that next job, so that you can kind of like hone your time. Where are you focusing? So if you're looking at those companies and you maybe have a list of 20 to 30 companies, I don't recommend having 200, by the way, have a manageable list of companies that you want to get into, then that helps you define the next piece, which is leveraging your network. And networking has told us that 85% of all of the best jobs come through your network. So you might be nurturing your networks just so that people know that you are looking for another job, but you also can leverage your network to make sure that you are finding people who know people in the companies that you're targeting. Because if there's a company that you want to get into and you can find somebody in your network who might be able to champion you, put your resume forward to the hiring manager, or get you in front of HR or the recruiter, that's going to have a much greater success rate than just trying to apply online. So these are the 4 pillars that you really want to be considering going forward and looking for that next job. Now, once you do that, you've got to have a plan. So I would recommend that everybody, if you're looking for the next job, I see it as a part-time job, not a full-time job. I tell my clients that they should focus on their job search about 20 to 25 hours a week when they're not interviewing. And once they interview, they're probably going to increase their time per week in their job search to maybe more like 30 to 35 hours a week that they're focusing their time, because the interviewing tacks on a lot more preparation, which we're obviously going to talk about. So let's go to the first polling question and get your insights as to how you found your last job. We'd love to know.
Got about 13 out of the 18 folks so far. So just, I'll give it another minute.
Okay.
All right, the results are in.
Great. So we can see that it's kind of split between online postings and leveraging your network. I would say online postings, it may depend also on where you are in an organization. The higher you go up, if you get into that VP, C-suite level, really your network is going to be primary. But if you are an individual contributor or you are in the management level, you're going to see a lot more postings, especially today. So when Danica said that HR postings are up by 52%, I mean, that just tells you right now companies are hiring and there's a lot more out there. So the likelihood of finding that next job through an online posting is probably greater than I think it might have been, 5 years ago. But certainly your network is essential. So make sure that that is a key component of finding your next role. Okay, so let's now talk about essentials for your resume. And I think it's important to look at what is the story that you're trying to tell? That's the number one question I ask my clients. What's the story that you're trying to tell? And what is the job that you want to have next? When most people put together their resume, unfortunately, they think so much about what they've done in the past that they aren't always positioning themselves for what they want to do in the future. So for example, if you are in HR and you really want to be an HR business partner and you don't want to be on the recruiting side of things, and that's what you've done in your prior jobs, you might, under your work experience, talk about the recruiting, but when you're branding yourself at the top of your resume, and I assume that all of you know that sort of the style of resume today has a branding section that's in between your name and contact information and that reverse chronological work history. In that branding, you want to be putting out there everything that is going to position you to be seen as that HR business partner or whatever that role is that you want to do next. Not that you need to downplay completely what you've done in the past, but you just need to align it so when somebody sees your resume, that's what they're focused on. Now, there's some other essentials in here that I'm not going to go over, like the formatting and so on, because you'll have a copy of this so you can read that. But I do think it's important to talk about accomplishment statements because that's really what is key to resumes today. And it helps you to get the sort of the buzzwords in on your resume, but more importantly, those accomplishment statements are what's going to grab somebody's attention to want to read your resume. And that's all going to be primarily in your work history. But I often will take that top branding section of a resume, have maybe a paragraph that's an overview of what you do exceptionally well. I might have some areas of expertise, but I love to put in career highlights. And when I put in career highlights, these are accomplishment statements. So they're going to be there, but they would also be the bullets under each of your previous positions. So let's look at two styles of accomplishment statements. The first are PAR statements. They are traditional. That's kind of what we've been seeing for years and years. And it is having a style where you talk about the problem or the situation, then the action, and then the result. So kind of the numbers, the percentages, some of those things are usually at the end. And it kind of follows the order of how you might answer an interview question, or it certainly follows the order of the process of what you did. Here was the thing that we needed to work on. This is what we did, and this was the result of it. So that's a PAR statement, and that's what we saw for years and years. Now, and you have examples here, so I won't go into that. I really want to talk about the XYZ statements, which are the next type of accomplishment. So Jessica, if you could advance the slide to the next page and seeing these XYZ statements. Now, I'm in the Bay Area. In the Bay Area, we are driven everything tech. If you go on the website for many of the bigger tech companies, in their career section, they often have videos and guides for what it's like to interview, how you should apply, what your resume should look like. And many of them talk about this XYZ formula. And it's kind of taking the PAR statement and it's flipping it on its end so that the result, or the punchline, as I like to put it, is at the front of your bullet. And it's that accomplished X as measured by Y by doing Z. So if you look here, you see the numbers are more at the front end. Why that's partly important is because it helps you to get to like, what's really the most important thing? It's what I did. It's not always the action items that I or the steps that I took in the process. It's really about what was that end result. And when you flip it this way, sometimes you can actually shorten your bullets so that they're a little bit more clear. I like to see bullets be as much as possible, maybe only a single line, or not take up all of a second line so that it creates a little bit more white space, and it also keeps the reader engaged. But also having the numbers on the left side of the page along the lines of those bullets, and we in the English language read the left side of a resume, having those numbers on the left side grab the reader's attention and make them want to understand more. And so you can keep in mind when you're creating this kind of a statement that if you have those numbers at the front end and somebody is reading it and you don't necessarily feel like you've got all the room that you would want to explain how you got there, that's okay. Give them some nuggets of information and allow them in the interview process then to ask you about that. Because your resume should also be a guide for the interview. These are the things I want people to ask me about. So your bullets should definitely be showcasing the impact you made on the organization, but they're also to help drive the interview so that the interviewer will ask you about those things that you're most proud of. So this is a guide for you. I have to always point out the third one on here because I like it the most, because it's got a number, it's got a symbol, it's got the acronym, it has with the Y over Y, it's got the all caps, and then it's got even big deal in quotes. So that kind of a bullet gets somebody to read it. So your job when you're writing a resume is to not just showcase who you are, but to make sure somebody actually wants to read your resume. And this is one of the best formulas that I would recommend. So from there, let's go into the next polling question and see how many of you have your resume ready to go.
Still submitting some answers, so just
Yeah.
a couple more seconds here.
Yep.
All right, get those answers in. We're going to close here in about 15 seconds. All right, looks about split.
Yeah, it's a really even split. So my recommendation is if you have your resume ready to go, good for you. And if you are still working on it, hopefully this presentation will give you a few tips and help you on your way, because I think your resume, it's not just a document to apply for a job. I think it really helps a person define what they want to showcase and what they want to push forward and what they want other people to see. So it's a great guide for you as well as the person who's going to read it. So let's talk about really diving into interviews and preparing for interviews. So I put this in 3 pillars: research, prepare, and practice. When you're researching for that next job and you're looking at, how do I put my best foot forward? You want to start with the people. Who are you going to be interviewing, or who's going to be interviewing you, I should say? What's the leadership of the organization? Who might you be supervising? You can go on LinkedIn, you can go on the company website. There are different places where you can go to see who those people might be. But I would take that a step further and think of who your internal and external partners might be in your role. So are you working with outside agencies or other types of vendors? Are there other people in the organization that aren't really in that direct line of succession above or below you, but other people that you would be working with? And understanding who those people are and thinking of as you're creating questions that you're going to ask in the interview, thinking of who those other people might be, because that's going to help to show that you have done your homework on what your sphere of influence is and who you're going to be working with. But then also looking, of course, at the company and what are the products and services, their business results, the industry, the customers, the competition, and the culture. And I think a lot of people, when they look at these, say, yes, I know I need to research those, so that if they ask me the question, what do I know about the company and what do I know about them, I can answer that question. I think the preparation, I know that's the next pillar, but the preparation about the company is to really understand their business so that you can ask the best questions to them. Don't necessarily wait for them to ask you, what do you know about us? When you're thinking of the questions that you're going to ask in the interview, you want to be asking about their customers. Who are some of the customers that have made the biggest impact on their organization this year? Who are customers that they value the most? What are they doing when it comes to the competition that maybe just put out a product, last month? How are they thinking of addressing that and competing with that in the market? And of course, you always want to think of culture, and there should be a lot of culture questions that you ask. And that preparation of doing the research so that you can ask questions is, I think, a different level of just preparing and researching so that you can answer questions. But I think when you prepare, what do you need to know or learn about them to make a good decision about them? That's another piece of that preparation. What are your deal makers and your deal breakers when it comes to hiring? It looks like we just advanced when it's looking at that next opportunity. I actually have a scorecarding process that I have my clients go through to create a scorecard for themselves of what they're looking for in that next role, and then identifying their deal makers and their deal breakers so that they're making a good decision. And then also, you want to practice everything that you're going to talk about in the interview. What are the stories that you want to tell? They should most likely be on your resume. But you could also be looking at that job description and thinking everything on that job description you could be asked about. Like every bullet has multiple components, and you might in that interview process be asked about each one of those components separately. Tell me about a time when you've done this or this or this or this. So you want to think of the stories that you're going to tell when you're asked those questions. You also want to think of, what do you want to do and why do you want to do it? The value that you're going to bring to the company, and of course, those questions that you want to ask. So all of those things go into the preparation. And interestingly, I'm working with a ton of people right now who are interviewing, and most of them are putting in, I would say, somewhere between, depending on the level of the position that they're applying for and the type of company, anywhere from 5 to 10 hours of preparation for their interviews, especially prior to that first interview with the hiring manager. So it takes quite a bit of time. And I think if you prepare, the other thing about preparing is that you want to be comfortable with any question that you're going to get asked. So part of that preparation is knowing what questions you want to ask and how you're going to answer them. But I think a lot of it is so that it helps you in your confidence, so that you go into that interview feeling comfortable and ready for whatever comes your way. But let's talk next about the types of interview questions. So the types of
really quick before we move on, there's a question and you're kind of answering it, but I just wanted to make sure that it gets asked properly. That
Sure.
like, what types of questions should I be asking myself before I start a job search? Like, where do I begin? What kind of questions should I be asking myself before I even dive into to this?
I think the first question to be asking yourself is, who do you want to work with? I think when it comes to joining a company or being in a job, the number one thing is actually the people. It's not the job. For example, I think you can be in a company and your job is so-so, but if you love the people, you will stay there for a long time, because it's great to be around people who you know, you trust, they have your back, you have their back, they're doing great things. You can have a long tenure at that company. But if you are looking at a company or you're in a job and you don't, or you love the job, but you don't really like the people that much, your days are kind of numbered. So I think the number one thing is, who are the people, the types of people that you want to work around? What does that look like? What does the leadership look like? What does your team look like? How do they make decisions? How do they treat each other? What that culture internally? Is that culture in the department or the team that you would join the same as the rest of the company? Because companies change all the time. So if you like the culture of your team, but you look at the rest of the company, you're like, I'm not really sure about that. That could be a problem going forward. So always start with the people first. And then, of course, you want to align whatever that job description is with the things that you really enjoy, playing to your strengths and playing to what you love most.
Thank you.
Yeah. So let's talk about the types of questions that you're going to get asked. There's really sort of three sets, if you will. There's the behavioral focus questions. I'm going to make an assumption that for all of you who are in HR, you're pretty familiar with this type of a question. It's a tell me about a time when, or describe for me a time when. And what's really important here is that you give a specific. I think that sometimes people ask a behavioral interview question, and when somebody comes back and they say, well, that happens all the time, but this is how I would handle that, then we all know that they didn't ask that question. So the formula that I use in answering behavioral based interview questions is the STAR. And I'm going to tell you the STAR is a little different than what you might have seen. STAR is STARR. S stands for situation. Give something specific. 2 years ago, I was working in this position and this was the situation, or this was the problem. And the T is for what you were tasked with or what your title was. I was in this role and I took the lead, or I was part of a team and I took this responsibility in that process. And then, of course, your A is going to be your action. This is where, quite frankly, people need to get really succinct about what that situation was and not try to go into explaining the whole thing, but really give the high level 4, 5, 6 things that you needed to do in that situation. They can always come back and ask you more questions, so don't feel like you have to talk through everything in the A's. And then the first R is results. You probably guessed that. You talk about, this is what ultimately happened. We fixed the problem, we hit the target, we hit the deadline, we didn't hit the deadline, we kept the client, we lost the client, whatever it might be. Here's the secret sauce. This is the second R. The second R is when you come back and you talk about reflection. After you've gone through your situation, task, actions, and results, then you want to start with what I took away from that, or my greatest lesson in that was this. And because then you could talk about how you learn from that and you would apply it going forward. You might even be able to align it to this next company and say, when I was in that situation, we had to deal with these things. I think that your company, that actually might look a little different. And I might be thinking of these things instead. It shows your aptitude, it shows your business acumen. So think of that second R, that reflection. It's really empowering when you get into the interview process. Now, there's situational questions and whiteboarding, and that is where you are basically asked a question of how would you handle something, and it's a scenario. You can't really prepare for it because you don't know what question's going to get asked, but if you are practicing your stories of what you've done in the past, you can prepare for the style of how you might want to answer these. So you can kind of think a little bit along the lines of that STAR method. If you were given a situation, you might say, well, if this is the situation and I was tasked with this, I would take these steps and this is the result that I would be trying to achieve. Now, whiteboarding, if any of you have done that, of course, that really is where you kind of have a whiteboard and you diagram it out, and you might have to walk through some kind of a process. I will tell you, if you haven't whiteboarded, go on YouTube. There are tons of videos out there that are really helpful on how to do whiteboarding. And I, of course, see this mostly in engineering, not necessarily HR, but I have had HR professionals who have been asked to kind of walk through some kind of a process and what they would do. So whiteboarding can come up for you as well. The third type of question is doing a presentation or case study. And I see this all the time right now for anybody who is manager and above. I can't think of one person I've worked with this year who's a manager or above who was not asked to put together a presentation or some kind of a case study for a job interview. And that's where you have a PowerPoint or some kind of a slide deck. You might be needing to put together writing examples. You might have to show diagrams and workflows, but you're usually doing a lot of preparation in advance of your interview. And then you're going into the interview and you're presenting to a team of people. And of course, right now, a lot of that is virtual, but that could be in person as well. So if you are not comfortable with PowerPoint, I would work on that. And if you aren't comfortable presenting in front of people, then that's where you're going to need to put a lot of that practice in when you get to interviewing and are asked about this. And I will tell you, I had one client who interviewed 3 times at the same company. Like, she took one job, she went all the way through, she didn't get that, they called her back for another. And in each situation, she had to go through the entire process and had to do a different case study for each of those different roles. So they don't necessarily recycle them for the next thing, just so you know about that. Okay, we're going to go into a breakout room now. And the question for all of you is, what strategies have helped you to prepare for interviews? So Jessica, I think we have 10 minutes. Is that right?
I'm in a breakout group.
Good deal. All right, Julia, what do you say? Should we keep marching on?
Yes.
Okay, let's do it.
So one of the things that I wanted to highlight were some of the most common interview questions. And I heard in one of the breakout rooms that somebody has been collecting or keeping lists of all the questions they've been asked in the past, or good questions that they like. And I highly recommend that. I have quite frankly, a 7-page document of interview questions that are broken into things like, HR and finance and leadership management, programs and so on. And they're all collected from people that I've worked with who've come back to me and said, these were the questions that we were asked. So I do think that that's very helpful, because you can go back and think, how would I answer that question today? I might have answered it differently, say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, or I might have a new story to tell today, or you might even have more than one story. Because sometimes when you get asked a question, there's actually a value. If somebody asks you, tell me about a time when you did this, you might even be able to say, you know what? I actually had that happen to me a few times. I can tell you about a recent example, or I could tell you about one that I think is actually a little bit more complex, but it happened 5 or 6 years ago. Do you have a preference? And kind of that strategy and giving them a choice does a few things. One, it tells them that you've dealt with it more than once, so you probably have more experience in that area. You also can say that maybe they're a little bit different, so you can put a context to it. One's maybe a little bit more recent and maybe less meaty, if you will, but another situation would be a lot more complex. But the other thing is that when you give them a choice, the time that it takes to tell them that they have a choice and let them decide what they want and come back to you often will buy you a good 10 to 15 seconds. And so that computer brain of yours can use that time to get a little bit more organized as to how you want to answer the question, whatever that story is. So I like that strategy. But I did want to list here some of the key questions that get asked in an interview. And I wanted to talk a little bit about them, because I think that they sometimes have a reputation that might be a little bit different, or people don't know exactly what to do with them. So I wanted to give a little bit of time to talking about these. And I find that a lot of times people prepare for those stories about situations, but some of these questions are about you personally. And when they are questions about you personally, that's where I find that people just stumble the most. They're most concerned about how they would answer that. So of course, the number one question, tell me about yourself. And an interviewer often thinks, oh, this is a softball question. And yet the candidate for the job is like, oh my gosh, what am I going to say? So the thing I want you to really think about when it's about tell me about yourself is, this is your opportunity to connect with the person that you're talking to. Let them see you for who you are. It is not a question that says, walk me through your whole career history. It's more about, why do you do what you do? What do you love about it? Maybe how you got into it, maybe a little bit of how you've done that in each of your roles. But really, it's a question that helps sort of launch the relationship with the person that you're talking to help them to see you in their organization, whether it's working with them or working with other people. So think of that question not as that linear background, overview from job to job to job, but you might say, when I was in college, I was studying this, or when I worked in a company, 10 years ago, and I really learned these things from it. And it's what launched my career into HR. And this is what I love about the HR world and what I do. So they can kind of see your philosophy and your mindset, but more than anything, it kind of builds that bond. Of course, you're going to get asked why are you leaving, or why are you no longer at your last employer? We call the answer to that your exit statement. Why did you exit? I talk to a lot of HR folks, so you all could probably add in whether you see it this way, but I've heard from a lot of HR professionals that really what they're looking for is to see if there's kind of a drama story behind it, and to make sure that you feel kind of comfortable with whatever that story is. So the important thing is to know what that story is, be honest, be direct, be succinct and short, and make sure that what's also conveyed is what happened then is sort of done there. I'm here. I'm ready for this next job. So you want to be able to move on. Of course, you want to also answer, why do you want this job? And I hear a lot of people when they first think of that, it's like, oh, well, it's close to home, or I could learn all of these other things. Here's the number one rule of interviewing. It's always about them. It's not about you. It's never about you. It's always about the company that you're talking to. So when you say, why do I want this job? It's, I am so excited to be part of this and to see what your company is doing and to be able to have your company move forward. So you want to be pushing what the value is that you're going to bring to them. And that is showcasing you, but it's not really talking about yourself. You're talking about them. Why should we hire you? Why should we hire you, and what sets you apart from other candidates are both opportunities for you to get really clear about the value that you bring. You should always have maybe 3 or 4 things that you feel are the distinguishing experiences or features or values or philosophies that you are going to bring to that next job. So why should we hire you? You should hire me because I've done this before, which is obviously something they're looking for, and I'm going to be able to, hit the ground running fast and accomplish this for you. Or it could be this other thing, but it's always thinking about them, but it's always saying the value that you're going to bring. Now, one of my favorite questions is, tell me about a time when you had a conflict with a coworker. I think this gives some people like more anxiety than any other question. And I think because they read the word conflict and think, I have to expose that I don't like somebody, or somebody doesn't like me, or I got into a shouting match with someone, or, there was some great disagreement. Conflict is really about solving problems. And when a conflict arises at work, it doesn't mean that you sort of had to duke it out. What it means is, we had an issue here and I saw it one way and somebody else saw it another way. And we had to figure out how we were going to fix that problem by having a meeting of the minds. So when you think of that conflict, think of stories where maybe you didn't see things the same way somebody else did, or maybe you had to get something done, but in order to do that, you needed or you required information from some other group, and that group or that person wasn't getting you that. That can be a conflict. It doesn't have to be that you're exposing tough relationships in the office. So I would say if that's a question that's really bothered you, think about other scenarios where you actually solved something. How did you actually work with somebody to understand them, to help them understand you so that you could solve that problem? What are you most proud of? I find that a lot of people don't even think about this. They think so much about the tactics of what they're going to do in the job that they don't think, what are you really proud of? What have you done? I usually align this as people, process. It could be technology. It could be revenue results. But what are you most proud of? I think this is a great question to prepare because every time somebody thinks of what they're most proud of, they get a smile on their face. And you want that warmth to come through. So think of what you're most proud of. And maybe that's even one of the stories that you try to weave in somewhere, because that's where you're going to light up. And it's an opportunity to let them see you, maybe relax a little bit and really shine. Now, what's your leadership style philosophy? Actually, one of my least favorite questions here. I don't like it because I feel like everybody has a canned answer for it, but you might get asked this question. But I would say if you're going to talk about your leadership style or philosophy, I would spend very little time trying to explain what it is. And instead, I would give an example. Give an example of when you have executed or demonstrated your leadership style. My style is to be this. Let me tell you, about when I was working with so-and-so or working on this project, because I think that'll be the best way for you to see what my style and my philosophy is. Give them a story. That's a great time to do that. So if you have other questions, we might at the end, be able to talk about some of the interview questions, or maybe you can put some in the chat if there are other interview questions that that you're thinking of. But let's pull up the next poll question, because I'd love to know, of these choices, which interview question concerns you the most?
So we'll leave the poll up for about 30 more seconds. Go ahead and submit your answers to what question of the options here. All right.
Okay. So tell me about a time when you had a conflict with a coworker. That wins the prize of what concerns people the most. Hopefully I've given you maybe a different way of looking at it and thinking not so much this is about a time when you and somebody else didn't get along, but this is about a situation in the company where you saw things differently and you needed to figure out how you were going to work together to solve the problem. Make it more about that than more about that personal, relationship. I think you can give a much better story there, and that might help out just a little. So then let's talk about interview fatigue. When Danica and I were talking about this, I said, I've got to bring this up. And I have to bring this up because I work with so many people on preparing for interviews. And I said up front that oftentimes when you're looking for another job, you might spend 20 to 25 hours a week looking for that job, and then it might increase 25 to 35 hours a week when you are interviewing. But I've seen a lot of people interview at a lot of places, and when you are doing that, the amount of work that you put in, you have to put the same amount of work in for every single job. I mean, there's some things that you can sort of carry over from one interview to the next interview. I mean, meaning from like a different company to a different company, but it's exhausting. And what a lot of people don't know is that I would say the interview process itself, not the job search process, but the interview process itself, I'm seeing can be 6 to 12 weeks. I've seen a few go faster, but that's very, very few. I've seen some go longer. That has a whole different red flag to it. Like, why are they having trouble making a decision? But I mean, when you're looking for that next job, you have to think that you could start them from the minute you get your resume in front of them. It might be 3 months before you actually are sitting in a chair at that company. So that's a long timeline. It's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You've got to kind of pace yourself a little bit. You should also prepare that you're going to interview with a lot more people today than I ever saw people interviewing with even 15, 20 years ago. When I started, and I was a recruiter, by the way, for years and years. And when I started in 95, I think maybe there were 4 people that someone would interview with. And today it's often 10 plus people that you're going to meet with. And sometimes that's a different person each day. You may have panel interviews, meaning that you are meeting with multiple people in one session, or it could be a panel of interviews, meaning you go from one person to the next, to the next, to the next. But there are, I think almost everybody that I've worked with in the last six months or so has had a minimum of 10 interviews. So, and it's again, combination of one-on-one and panels and groups. So prepare yourself for the long haul. And then I already talked about doing presentations and case studies, which usually comes after maybe the 4th round of interviews. And what I did talk about in that I should probably showcase, if you are told to do a presentation or a case study, I want you to make sure that you always ask the question, who is my audience? That's the number one question that you should always ask when you do a presentation. But when you're going to do a presentation or case study, you need to know who's going to be in that interview process and who's going to be watching that. And is it just those people in the meeting, or is it recorded and then it's shared with others? You know, how does that all work? But the presentations and case studies often will take people 8 to 10 hours sometimes to put that together, because you've got to get your mind around, what am I talking about? How am I going to format that? What is the the purpose and the meaning behind it? So it can really take a long time. So it's a backbreaker when it comes to having to put together those things. And then in the end, if you didn't get the job or things are moving slowly, there's such minimal feedback. And I think that's one of the hardest things to being a candidate, is not knowing where you are in the process and not getting any kind of real feedback about what's happening. I know that the standard answer oftentimes is we decided to go into another direction, and there's just not much that you can do with that. But that fatigue is what I'm seeing a lot of people feel right now in the interview process. And I think it's why a lot of companies say that they can't find candidates and they're struggling to hire. I think part of the time their process is so long that people are bailing out of the process, and it's not necessarily working in companies' favor. And that might be something that Danica and even all of you can contribute to, sort of the pros and cons of the process. But interview fatigue is tough, especially if you are talking to multiple companies at one time, and each one is like its own special project.
Julia, I'll interject. I'll interject and completely agree that in 30 plus years of HR, I've never seen the decision process be so belabored. It's one of the things as a recruiter we try and nail down. What is the decision process? Who is involved? Because you've said that people should research who they're talking to. So for that to happen, we know who they're talking to. But the number one complaint of every candidate is not knowing their disposition. It's very rude, I think. And then the not a fit, different direction is not very helpful either. So for those of you on this call who are responsible for designing your own company's interview process, really pay some attention to that. We all want to feel wanted, right? And if we're not wanted, we just want to know. It's like when you're in a relationship and you're dating and you don't know if they want you or not, right? But that's not comfortable. People aren't going to bring their best selves forward if they're in such uncertainty around whether they're a fit or not. So if you want the free advice to improve your own recruiting process inside your companies, I will say respond to the resume, tell them what the process is, and then stick to that. And in order to do that, you got to know what your own process is before you start bringing talent into the office.
Right. Thank you. That was so helpful. So I think from here, I think if you have any questions, Jessica, did you see anything in the chat or any questions that people want to bring forward?
Yeah, I have actually a couple. I have 4 questions actually. Okay. And then again, this is an open invitation to anyone on the line who has a question that they wanted to ask during breakout but weren't able to, or comment about that. But I'm going to just go ahead and ask some of the questions that came through. So one of the questions, and I guess it's 2 questions, but we'll kind of just cover both of them in the one. So can you speak to either changing industries and how to kind of market yourself when you don't have the particular skill set or experience? And then kind of the second part of that is, especially now during COVID, a lot of people just have a break, right, in their resume or in their job history. So, with either the gap or the lack of experience in changing industries, can you speak to some of that?
Sure. So I think when it comes to changing industries, one of the best things is to think think a couple of different ways. First of all, are there things that are transferable from the industry that you've been in the past that would transfer over? So for example, if you were working in a highly regulated environment, so maybe you were, there's banking and there's biotech. I know those look very, very, very different, but they're both highly regulated industries. You might want to try to tie in that you've worked in that highly regulated environment and you understand about compliance and reporting and how you have to sort of follow some kind of a structure there. Those are the kind of the first things. I would say the other thing when it comes to changing industries is sometimes you have to figure out what is it that I need to learn, or who do I need to know, or how do I make that happen? And that honestly, that might mean that there's a short-term plan and a long-term plan. So if you need to get a job, you might have to go get a job right now because that's what a lot of people have to do. But if you really want to change industries, you might have to think, what does that industry require of me? Do I need to get a certification? Do I need to take a course? Maybe I need to network in that arena. So if you really want to change industries, you might find out now that events are coming back up again, what kind of symposiums are there where I can go not only educate myself on what's happening in that industry, but who could I meet who's in that industry so that I can build up my network? Because one, I think the biggest challenge is for, say, like LinkedIn. Recruiters use LinkedIn to find people. And when they're doing that and they're looking for keyword searches, a lot of times they are looking at industry. Well, if you don't have a foundation in that industry, you might need to get that. And if you don't have connections in that industry, the degrees of separation between that recruiter and you might be kind of wide. So you might need to do things like educate, learn, find other projects, volunteer, go to events where people are in that area so that you could talk the talk a little bit more and build your network of people who are already in that arena. That's the first thing I would say. In terms of a gap on a resume, I'm going to be very honest and say that I've been recruiting and been in coaching for so long that gaps don't bother me as much. I think a lot of people have gaps, and I don't think people worry about them so much so long as you have a good story behind them. But I do think there's an opportunity to say, I stayed busy in some other way. And if that is like in a non-COVID time, you volunteered, weave that in, that you were volunteering. You could also go back and take classes, even though those classes may not always be the biggest thing to get you that next job. People are going to ask you, what have you been doing for maybe the last 6 months? And you're like, oh, I went on Coursera and I got certified in these 3 different areas. And that shows initiative, it shows drive, it shows that you're not complacent. And that's how I would try to bridge that gap a bit. And we all know that it's been a tough job market and a hiring market. So I think there's a little bit more flexibility and liberty on that, but show that you've stayed busy. I don't know if Danica, you have anything else to add to that, because you might see that as well.
I would agree. And there's as many opinions of this as there are recruiters, right? They don't bother me either. I think if people have a good story to tell, not explanation, I'm not here to judge them. We see gaps, especially of people of a certain age where they took time off to care for aging parents, and they decided to come back into the job market and COVID hit, right? So they decided to stay out longer. But my personal preference is to know as I'm looking at that resume, right? If you call it a sabbatical or took a break for personal reasons, and to know some of those things in advance. If you do have a break, I would suggest that you apply for things now if you're ready, because there's such a dearth of talent out there that people are more understanding than they used to about breaks, because there's a talent shortage, right? So talent is in control right now in many ways. So now is a good time to address that and get back in. And you can also, like the Taproot Foundation, they take volunteers that help nonprofits with HR projects, things of that nature. But I agree that there needs to be an explanation, and you are going to get asked about it. I just took some time off is probably going to be a red flag for a recruiter if you don't share some of the things you suggested, Julia, like, and what did you do during that time off? Right? And how did you stay relevant With people who've had large gaps, I've said, labor law has changed pretty significantly in the last 3 or 4 years in California. How have you stayed current is a question on that.
Mhm. Right. So I think if you have that gap, show that you learned or you contributed or both. Those are the two things. Absolutely. Okay.
A couple more here to get
Mhm.
through. We have actually really liked this question too. How do you plan a career as opposed to just having a job? Like, what's the difference between those things, and how should you think about that? I know,
Oh, that's
one.
that's a whole nother hour we can talk about, but there's a lot out there right now. I think one of my favorite phrases that has come about in the last few years, I don't know when it started, but last few years, is career agility. Being able to move around sometimes within your career. And I think that's where people get the most job satisfaction. You want to have skills that are important to whatever arena you're in. But career agility is to have others see the value that you bring and realize that you can do other things. And then you have an opportunity to be a little bit perhaps selective. But I think when you're planning your career, the number one place to start is to know a combination of what you're good at and what you enjoy. It's like, I'm a Gallup certified strengths coach. I use strengths very often with my clients to get them clear on what are you good at? What do you do well? What do you like to do? Because I think that's the biggest component to planning your career and having longevity in it. If you aren't clear on those things, you can sometimes find that you took role after role after role, and suddenly you're sitting there going, how the heck did I get here? This isn't really what I want to do. And if you are clear on what you like and enjoy and are good at, then you're going to be better at saying yes and no. You want to say yes and no to the right things. Say yes to those things that you feel are going to fuel your soul, but also may add to your resume. But it's really important to think in terms of more career agility. And I don't think that necessarily means that you have to think of title. I think sometimes people think of titles and they think of that ladder. We're such a progressive focused or progression focused society that says you have to move up. Career agility is more about being able to move around and add value and also have job satisfaction. So that's what I would focus on. I hope that answered that question.
Yeah, great.
It's not always the same for everybody either. I think that's the other thing. You have to really know yourself.
Danica, anything to add to the concept of career versus just a job?
Oh, you're muted.
Thank you. I covered it right then. I do think that job satisfaction and agility are synonymous, right? It's not always about the title, and it's depending on the size of the organization. And we all know in HR, what do titles mean in HR? What is a vice president at one company is a manager at another company? And so really focusing on what it is you like to, what the parts you like to do, right? Early in my career, I was a very, very good management union negotiator. But I don't like to do that. And so for me, the career in HR didn't include that anymore after a couple of jobs, right? That's how I think of it. Although I got approached for very high paying jobs that were in labor frequently. But my career wasn't going to take me in that direction.
Right.
Good example.
And I think a lot of people who are probably in your sphere of influence, family, friends, colleagues will say, you should go do this because they see how you're really good at something. It is up to you to be your own advocate to say, you're right, I could do that and I would be wildly successful. But wow. I wouldn't be happy in that. And there's always that point where it's like, we all have our cliff where we get to the edge of the cliff and we're like, I don't want to go further because I'm gonna fall down. I need to stop. So you have to be your own advocate.
All right. And switching perspectives here on this last question, as an employer, how do I put myself into a candidate's shoes to make their experience with me as the interviewer a positive one? How do I get into their perspective.
Oh, right. Well, I think Danica talked a lot about it, and that last slide did, is understanding what your process is. And I think that almost everything comes down to a combination of communication and perceptions. Understanding what their perceptions might be and communicating that so that you address those things, or addressing things so that you manage their perceptions. There is a lot of confusion for candidates. And so the more companies can be communicative and concise and think of what that experience is for the candidate, I think that's probably the best thing that you can do. And I think that it's valuable for HR teams to even ask for feedback, whether that's somebody that you hired or even somebody you didn't. How did you feel in our interview process? Get some of that intake information so that you're getting, that kind of data as well. But knowing your process and what that's like and managing perceptions through communication, I think is probably the best thing. But I will say, I realize that not everybody who's in that HR team and is kind of the facilitators of all this are completely in control. And it might mean that you also have to go back to your executive team or your managers and help them maybe see how that candidate experience is looking to the people that they're interviewing with. Because I do think that some companies that are struggling to hire because people are dropping out of the process because they're so frustrated. And yet the employers are saying, it's just hard to find people. It's not hard to find people. It's hard to engage people and get them interested in you, especially if the process is very long.
There's
So
a
maybe
lot of
just
good
being aware.
information.
Yeah.
There's a lot of good information on the Talent Board website. They run a program called the Candy Awards, which is the Candy Experience Awards. I think it's about 6 years old. And whether you choose to, companies are signing up to ask all applicants how the interview process went. I don't think you have to go that far, but just reading the results can give you a lot of insights on companies that are examining their experience, right? Companies have whole teams of user experience, and candidates are a client group in many ways. So starting to think about those candidates as customers, even if they're not the right fit, is important, as well as, thank you, Jess, as well as, they might not be a fit for this job, but if you treat them badly, and then the next time they're not going to come to you. And I couldn't agree more, Julia, that so many companies that are struggling to find talent aren't looking in the mirror and seeing what I'm doing to make myself an attractive employer. And this is part of that.
Right. Because this is part of a company's PR machine, honestly. Especially when one person may get hired and I know that there are, oftentimes bonuses for an internal employee referral. And yet sometimes you can't even get the employee internal referral because there are people who are like, oh yeah, I remember you complaining about how long that process was. I don't want to do that. So there's an opportunity to manage perceptions and really think about what's the best way to engage a candidate. So, and I will look at the talent board. So thank you for sharing that, Danica, because I hadn't looked at that.
Okay. I think that's about it for the questions. So we can wrap up here.
Well, thank you for everyone who participated. And Julia, thank you so much for sharing your insights. I have the great pleasure of engaging with Julia in lots of different formats and learn something every time. And today was no exception to that. So
well, thank you.
Who attended today. I hope you learned something as well. And as Jess mentioned, we will be publishing the recording of this session, and you can review it or share it as you like. So thank you very much, Julia. Appreciate your insights.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day. Happy holidays.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.